Today we'll be discussing the case of Shaquille Dukes. Shaquille is a young man from Chicago known for doing different things in the community, advocating for those who need a voice. From young, he would volunteer at different organizations in his community, and he would go on to study and do related work in the field. Now, Shaquille had a history of asthma. So when he arrived at the emergency room one Saturday with lung issues, it was expected that he would get some kind of treatment and be able to shortly head home. He left the hospital the very same day he arrived. However, it wouldn't be even 24 hours before Shaquille was back at the hospital to receive an official diagnosis of double pneumonia and acute bronchitis. After being admitted, Shaquille stated that a doctor allowed him to go for a walk outside of the hospital. And so Shaquille apparently took the doctor up on that offer. He headed outside wearing a patient hospital gown with an IV hooked up to his arm. And he thought this walk would be just a normal one that he's done previously when he was at the hospital earlier in the day. But this walk, unfortunately, would be different because it would only be a few minutes after stepping outside when Shaquille was approached by a security guard. And this guard demanded that Shaquille head back inside or he would apparently get in trouble for stealing the IV machine in his arm. Soon enough, a confrontation ensued. And this situation escalated very quickly. Not too long went by before police were called to the scene, and Shaquille, in his hospital gown, was arrested for attempted theft of the IV machine. News of this story quickly broke out online as video from this incident made its way across the internet. And many were outraged by the treatment Shaquille received, not just at the hospital, but while in police custody, because it would be during that short trip to the police station when Shaquille would undergo a medical emergency that nobody would have expected. And this case would soon go to court, leading to the oh-so-controversial question of who was at fault in this case. But before we get into this case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. But before we get into this case, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Okay, did you know that in the States, over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data and leaked online by hackers for free? And these stolen records included things like a person's full name, address, birthday, phone number, social security number, etc. Not even joking, this obviously doesn't compare to a national data leak, but this genuinely had me thinking about the time I got hacked on a virtual game as a kid, and the person who hacked me legit tried stealing my whole entire profile. I seriously remember how scared that incident made me at the time, so I can only imagine that happening in real life. That's where Aura comes into play. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to detect and alert you to potential identity theft. And it has a bunch of other features to help keep you safe online, all inside one app. Aura is only available for those with US-based addresses, so if you live in the States, you can go to my link at aura.com/petalpalmer to try 14 days free and let Aura help you figure out if any of your personal data has been exposed. My link for the 14-day free trial will be in my description below. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into this case. Shaquille Dukes was born on August 11th, 1994, either in or from somewhere around Chicago, Illinois. According to what's available on his public LinkedIn profile, from 2012 to 2016, he studied and received a Bachelor's of Science in Law Enforcement, Intelligence, and Analysis. And from 2016 to 2018, he studied and received a Master's of Arts in Law Enforcement and Justice Administration at Western Illinois University. He seemed to be very intelligent in school, as he received a 3.94 GPA during his bachelor's degree and a 3.99 GPA during his master's degree. Shaquille has a lot of experience volunteering, especially for the underserved. Since 2012, as a teenager, he's volunteered as a community critical incident response team. This is a position where he would work to provide resources in crisis or in high-risk, high-danger incidents in such communities. And since 2011, he volunteered as a youth and gang violence suppression strategist for a community policing program with the Chicago Police Department. In addition to this, he also worked as a founding executive director of a foundation working to overcome boundaries that plague underserved communities, including systemic racism, providing support, advocating, and encouraging excellence in the forms of things like entrepreneurship, partnership, collaboration, and leadership. Not only his volunteering, but he's also been employed as an executive operations consultant and a chief of staff. In June 2019, Shaquille, his then boyfriend Marcondrick Morrison, and his brother Credale Miles all decided to go on vacation to Freeport, Illinois. Freeport looks to be about a 2 to 3 hour drive away from Chicago, and Freeport looks to be highlighted by different parks. There's some museums. It's honestly just looks like a chill town. If you're from a large city like Chicago, it looks like it could be a place you could just relax at and not have too much going on as you would in the city life. Now, Shaquille was no stranger to some health issues. For most of his life, he suffered with asthma, and that's why it wasn't too much of a shock on Saturday, June 8th, 2019, when he had come into the hospital for asthma-related issues. Shaquille arrived at the Freeport Health Network, or FHN Memorial Hospital in Freeport, Illinois, and it was there where the care team would treat him for double pneumonia, acute bronchitis, and asthma exacerbation. After some time spent at the hospital that day, Shaquille appeared to be doing a bit better, and it would be later that Saturday he was subsequently released from the hospital. Now, despite being fine enough to be released, things unfortunately didn't last too long for Shaquille, because it was just that next day on Sunday, June 9th, when he was brought back to the hospital in an ambulance. During this trip, Shaquille was accompanied by his then boyfriend Marcondrick and brother Credale, and after spending a few hours in the emergency department, instead of being released, Shaquille was actually admitted to the FHN Memorial Hospital to stay inpatient. Shaquille was placed on the 4th floor in what was called the telemetry unit. This is a floor in the hospital where patients typically undergo continuous cardiac monitoring. This is to ensure there are no abnormal patterns that indicate serious heart problems. And this is where patients admitted from the emergency department are often assigned. Now, although the telemetry unit has the technology to remotely monitor its patients, because Shaquille was considered an overflow patient, he was actually not connected to a monitor at all. An overflow patient is essentially a patient who is placed in a unit when the medical or surgical units are at or over capacity. I guess because he was an overflow patient, while he did need to be admitted, I guess it meant he didn't necessarily need to be monitored. While in the unit, Shaquille was assessed by nurses and given the standard intravenous or IV saline fluids. They attached the IV through a needle into his arm, and the IV fluid bag was suspended from the top of a medical pole that was approximately 6 foot long. On this pole was a pump and a monitor, and because the IV pole was on wheels, Shaquille was able to walk with the IV in his arm. So in hospitals, if you don't know, there's not much to do while inpatient. For the most part, you're stuck solely on the floor you're on and typically spend most of the day in your room. Typically, you don't leave the floor you're on. However, you're usually allowed to walk around in the hallways of that said floor. Now, earlier that day, Shaquille, Marcondrick, Credale had gone for a walk outside. And while in the unit on the 4th floor, they decided they again wanted to go for a walk. So they asked the staff and a doctor named Dr. Murphy if they would be allowed to head outside to go for a walk. And according to them, Dr. Murphy and the staff were like, yeah, sure, that's fine. They soon took an elevator to head to the lobby. And it was when they were in the lobby when they played on the piano for a bit and then walked outside of the hospital doors to go for a walk around the hospital parking lot. This walk would have been Shaquille's way of getting some fresh air and get his legs moving, as typically hospital rooms or floors don't have windows that can open. So for the most part, the only way you could really get fresh air is if you head outside. But while on this walk, the three were soon stopped by a man named Ryan Godsil. And this was a security guard who worked at the hospital. Shaquille and the group were on hospital property in the parking lot, and Godsil was in his vehicle on the street when he called the group over. And when they walked over to Godsil, according to Shaquille and the group, Godsil supposedly told them, like, hey, that IV pole is hospital property, you're stealing right now. To which Shaquille and the group described to have been said in a, quote, rude, abrasive, and essentially unprofessional manner. And they were taken back that Godsil would accuse or suspect them of stealing the IV. To them, it made absolutely no sense why a patient, IV attached to arm, pumping out fluids in a hospital gown, would be attempting to steal an IV pole. But to Godsil, this seemed pretty reasonable. And that's when the problem continued to devolve into a larger confrontation. But nonetheless, both parties seem to have differing views on what truly went down. Now, Godsil was by himself facing the three men. And because the two parties began raising their voice and cursing at each other, he felt outnumbered and apparently threatened, and so he radioed for a fellow security guard colleague to call backup. And this security guard was named Ladarius Stewart. When Stewart answered the radio call, he did say to have heard, quote, yelling and obscene screaming in the background. And so he did, in fact, call the police. Now, amongst other things, some duties hospital security guards are responsible for are patrolling hospital grounds, checking the security of doors, intervening with problematic patients or visitors, and responding to other types of security calls as necessary. In a situation as this one, Godsil typically would be required to try to defuse the situation and return the patient safely inside. But this unfortunately would be the opposite to occur. Shaquille and the others were adamant that the walk was sanctioned by the medical team and that they were allowed to go on it. But to Godsil's understanding, patients weren't allowed to leave outside the hospital. And to him, they weren't just leaving. They were attempting to steal hospital equipment. Regardless, either or, there was no point in which Godsil attempted to radio the medical staff to confirm if Shaquille was in fact allowed to walk around the block or the hospital parking lot. After a short while, at around 4:38 p.m., the police officers arrived at what was described in the documents as the, quote, chaotic scene. The officers' names were Officer Fidecki and Officer Moore. And once they arrived, Officer Moore immediately got to questioning Shaquille, Marquandrick, Credell, and Godsil. Now, it said in court documents that, quote, the parties disagree whether Godsil accused plaintiffs of attempting to steal the IV equipment. But even though the video of the initial encounter is somewhat distorted because of music being played in the background, Godsil can be heard explaining that the IV pump and pole are hospital property and needed to go back. And what is shown from Officer Moore's body camera footage is that when he first arrived on scene, Godsil gave him a quick briefing on what was going on. And in that video, Godsil does in fact tell Officer Moore that because they were off hospital grounds with the IV equipment, regardless of the reasoning, that amounted to stealing hospital property, saying, quote, I don't care if they were coming back, that's stealing.
He's stealing hospital property, basically, by leaving. I don't care if he was coming back, that's stealing.
So after this quick debriefing, Officer Moore went up to Shaquille and the group and he explained to them that the guards are tasked with protecting hospital equipment, essentially explaining what Godsil had told him. But because by that point, the group was wholeheartedly adamant that they were authorized to go for the walk, Shaquille's brother, Credell, responded multiple times by telling the officer that there was no threat.
It's hospital property.
Yeah, but there's no threat. There's no threat.
Stop talking. The way you're acting.
And Shaquille went on to continue telling the officers that they were authorized to go for a walk and were clearly not stealing anything. So by that point, things were getting quite heated, and Officer Moore said to Credell, like, look, you're talking over others and you're raising your voice, you're causing a scene, you need to stop talking and I won't ask you again. Now, Credell felt the unreasonable energy and he responded, quote, what the F is you talking about? And it was after he said this when Officer Moore physically grabbed Credell, put handcuffs on him, and placed him in the back of the police car. Now, as that was happening, Officer Fidecki began attempting to de-escalate the situation by talking to Shaquille into returning to the hospital. But unfortunately, this attempt would fail after Marquandrick and Credell were told by the security guard that they were not welcome back inside the hospital. This was written as being a possible misunderstanding, as documents say that Shaquille, quote, may have interpreted that to mean none of the three were welcome back, and is heard on video saying, he said we're not there. So again, Officer Fidecki again asked Shaquille, like, hey, can you return to the hospital? But this time Shaquille responded, like, hey, I was told I was not allowed to go back. And it was by that point, Shaquille began attempting to remove the IV from his arm himself, and he refused to go back inside the hospital. Now, by that point in the situation, the nursing supervisor came outside and arrived on the scene. And when they did, like he stated before, Shaquille told the nursing supervisor that he was authorized to go for a walk. While that conversation is ensuing, it was at that same time when Officer Fidecki then went up to security Godsil to confirm that it was only Marquandrick and Credale who weren't allowed to go back inside the hospital, but that Shaquille, in fact, was. And the nursing supervisor can be heard on tape telling Shaquille that he was, in fact, allowed to come back into the hospital. But in the heat of the moment and with how everything unfolded, Shaquille felt as though it would be best if he didn't go back inside, as he didn't want to leave Marquandrick and Credale on the scene by themselves. And so he refused to go inside and explain to the nursing supervisor that he wanted to have his IV taken out immediately. By that point, somebody else arrived on the scene. And this person was Sergeant Zelaznik. When Sergeant Zelaznik arrived, Officer Fidecki began briefing him on everything that's happened. He explained the situation and he told him, hey, these two, Marquandrick and Credale, are not allowed back in the hospital. Now, around this time, Sergeant Zelaznik looked around the area and he noticed that Credale was in the back of the police car. But as he saw Credale, Sergeant Zelaznik actually recognized him, and he began explaining how he recently dealt with Credale before in a previous situation and described how he, quote, just wanted to argue. So by that point, Sergeant Zelaznik ordered for a nurse to come and remove the IV out of Shaquille's arm, and subsequently after this order, a nurse arrived on the scene and did just that. Once the IV was removed, Sergeant Zelaznik then ordered Officer Fidecki to approach Marquandrick and obtain his full name. But Marquandrick was still not feeling the situation, and so he refused to give his name as he still wanted to continue speaking about what just occurred. And as that was happening, Officer Fidecki then headed inside the police car to escort Credale to the jail at the Freeport Police Department. It says that on the body camera footage throughout the ride to the jail, Credale can be heard cursing and yelling at Officer Fidecki. And that once they arrived at the jail intake facility, as he sat in the back of the squad car, Credale continued yelling and cursing at Officer Fidecki. Soon enough, Officer Moore too arrived at the jail. And when he did, it was said in documents that Credale, quote, became especially belligerent. Now, as that all was going on, Shaquille and Marquandrick were still back at the scene at the hospital. Now, ideally, if you will, Shaquille would probably be allowed to leave to head back home, go to another hospital, or go wherever. But after Credale's arrest, that was when Sergeant Zelaznik then told Shaquille that he was in fact not free to leave, and he subsequently placed Shaquille in handcuffs. And Zelaznik then can be heard on video telling Shaquille that he was in fact under arrest for attempted theft.
Okay, they no longer under arrest. For what? For attempted theft. I didn't try to steal anything. Okay.
It was at that point when another officer, Officer Holden, walked Shaquille to the police car, placed him in the back of the car, searched his pockets, and removed his inhaler to place in the front of the car. He said to have told Shaquille he was removing the inhaler so that it wouldn't fall out of his pocket. And he told him that he should just let him know if he needed it before they began to drive off to the police department. Now, back at the scene, they told Marquandrick multiple times that he was free to leave. But Marquandrick was still upset about the situation, and so he stayed and continued saying his piece with the officers. It was at that point when police officers decided that they were going to arrest him as well. And it was said that this didn't come lightly or with any ease. When officers attempted to place him in handcuffs at first, Marquandrick instinctively moved his hand to avoid the officer's hand. He eventually did accept the arrest, telling the officers, hey, I'm not resisting. The ride to the station was only about 2.5 minutes long. And for the first half of the trip for Shaquille, he seemed to be doing just fine, and he was speaking with Officer Holden. But for the next half of the trip, which only lasted for a minute or so, Shaquille suddenly stopped talking to Officer Holden, and they subsequently arrived in the parking lot of the police department. Now, when they arrived at the department and Officer Holden stopped the car and looked in the back seat, he noticed that Shaquille appeared to look unresponsive. And so Officer Holden was like, hey, are you all right? But he received no response. As soon as this happened, Officer Holden got out of the car, ran to the other side, opened Shaquille's door, and within a second, called an ambulance for help. By this point, Shaquille was shaking significantly, and because of this, Officer Holden believed that Shaquille was having a seizure, and he told this to dispatchers. And while it doesn't state what exactly he did, the documents state that Officer Holden tried to assist Shaquille at that point. In the footage, Shaquille was shaking, and it was clear that he was struggling to breathe. In fact, he repeatedly told the officer that he couldn't breathe and that he needed help. So to try keeping Shaquille alert, Officer Holden urged him to continue talking and continue breathing, and he ensured to stay talking to Shaquille as they waited for some additional help to arrive. Soon enough, another officer arrived on the scene. Her name was Officer Hilby, and when she did, she took over in attending to Shaquille. Shaquille was still shaking significantly for just a little over a minute before he was able to regain his breath on his own. But by that point, he was still struggling to breathe and was breathing very heavily. Now, as mentioned, Shaquille was in the hospital for asthma-related issues. And with having asthma, it's important that he has his inhaler on him in case a situation like this where his airways are closing up occurs. But if you remember, Officer Holden took Shaquille's inhaler away as they entered into the car. And throughout this ordeal, as Shaquille was struggling to breathe, Officer Holden didn't end up immediately returning the inhaler to help the situation out. So Shaquille asked Officer Hilby, like, hey, can I get my inhaler? Officer Holden has it. So Officer Hilby went on to ask Officer Holden, like, hey, do you have the inhaler? And Officer Holden was like, yeah, let me go get it from the front seat. So Officer Holden grabbed the inhaler from the front of the car. Officer Hilby helped Shaquille use the inhaler twice, and subsequently after that, the emergency response team arrived on scene. Once they arrived, they got Shaquille loaded into the ambulance, and they began heading their way back to the hospital. Now, everyone on the scene, including the officers, initially thought that Shaquille had a seizure, and because of this is what they told the emergency response team when they arrived on the scene. But Shaquille wasn't or didn't have a seizure, and he told this to the responders when they were in the ambulance. Shaquille then asked Officer Holden, like, hey, do we need to go back to the hospital? And Officer Holden was like, yeah, we need to go back just to make sure you're okay. That was scary, and we wouldn't want that to happen again. Initially, after this happened, Shaquille wanted to get some kind of resolution for what had happened to him. He met with Freeport City officials and a representative from FHN Memorial Hospital just days after the incident occurred. But to his dismay, he said that the hospital representative insinuated that there could just be some sort of monetary solution to get them to go away. And he said that the police department weren't making any effort to truly investigate the case. Shaquille stated that he wanted no financial compensation whatsoever from the situation. He just wanted reform or policies so that something like this doesn't happen to anyone else. He said that he gave them 7 days to try to even show that they were planning to make any changes, but still nothing happened. And so, because of the responses he received from the hospital and the police department, Shaquille figured that the only way he might be able to get an effective resolution was if he shared his story to see what the public thinks about it. And that's why on June 17th, 2019, 1 week after this incident occurred, Shaquille went online to share what happened to him, his brother, and his then boyfriend. He posted this on his Facebook, and once the internet got a hold of it, it didn't take long for many to be shocked by what occurred in this case. In the post, which starts off with, quote, come to Freeport on vacation and leave on probation, Shaquille shared his experience advocating for change of the treatment of Black and brown minorities in the city of Freeport. In this post, he said, quote, this is truly one of the most racist cities in America. I was admitted into the hospital for double pneumonia. After receiving doctor's orders to walk around, I was stopped by an overzealous, racist security officer who claimed that I was trying to leave the hospital to sell the IV equipment on eBay. After a brief conversation, the guard called the police. I was advised by Sergeant Jeff Zalaznik, badge number 116, that I was being arrested for attempted theft of the IV equipment that was clearly attached to my arm. My brother was arrested and then me. Under the direction of Sergeant Zalaznik, officers stood by and watched while my IV was removed on the sidewalk, and it was not by a doctor. I told the sergeant I was being treated for pneumonia and asthma, and his words were, I don't care why you're here, you're going to jail. They took my rescue inhaler and began to transport me to the city lockup. While in transit, I began to have a seizure and subsequently an asthma attack. I pleaded with officers for almost 4 minutes to retrieve my inhaler from the transporting officer. And finally, when I became unresponsive, it miraculously appeared. I make this post not by pity, but as a beacon of hope for all Black and brown minorities dealing with the city of Freeport. We do not have to take this ish any longer. I've shared contact info for a great attorney who is ready and willing to intervene. This ends today. Anyone who sees this and has been served an injustice or was a victim of a crime initiated by Freeport PD, please reach out. People were outraged by what they've seen in this video. Many even left reviews for the hospital demanding that the security guard Godsil lose his job. Shaquille and Marquandrick were even later interviewed by CNN. And because of the backlash they were facing, about 2 weeks after this post, on June 30th, Freeport police released body cam footage of parts of the incident in an attempt to show and explain their side of what happened. And a third-party independent investigator was selected by the department to, quote, gather the facts, interview all parties involved, and determine whether officers conducted themselves in adherence to department policies and guidelines. This investigation included interviews of 5 Freeport police officers and 2 FHN hospital security officers. And a report was compiled by Hazel Crest Police Chief Mitch Davis, who also serves on the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And on August 8, 2019, Shaquille Marquandrick and Credale's attorney soon filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Freeport, the police department, and the FHN hospital. The lawsuit named defendants the Freeport Health Network, or FHN Memorial Hospital, security guard Ryan Godsil, Sergeant Jeff Zelaznik, Officer Dan Moore, Officer Justin Holden, and the city of Freeport, Illinois. In the lawsuit, Shaquille and the group brought a claim against the city defendants, including the sergeant, officers, and the city of Freeport for false arrest, Fourth Amendment, equal protection, failure to provide medical treatment, substantive due process, Monell, willful and wanton conduct, and they brought a claim against the hospital defendants, including the FHN hospital and security guard Godsil, for negligence, false imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. That same day, on the 8th, regarding the body camera footage, Shaquille posted a short 1-minute video of a meeting it appears he had with 2 individuals from the police department. And in that video, they themselves stated that there was, quote, issues in that video.
You cannot sit here and look me with a straight face and say that was over.
There were issues in that video,
which Shaquille described as contradictory, writing in the caption, quote, if you stand by your officers, why acknowledge the body cam video was problematic? As for the claims of false arrest, Shaquille's group filed a false arrest complaint regarding the arrest for attempted theft. He was initially arrested for theft despite still being on hospital property, on top of just not visibly attempting to steal regardless. In fact, in the court documents, it actually stated, quote, Godsil's statement evidences a fundamental misunderstanding of Illinois law regarding theft, which requires the intent to permanently deprive the owner of the property. Regardless, it also does state that it, quote, cannot be reasonably disputed that Godsil accused Plantis of stealing hospital equipment. Though there is the one thing available that can be seen from the initial encounter, and this was the video that Marquandrick filmed on his cell phone. It is obviously, like I explained, loud from the music, so you can't hear exactly what's being said, but from the little lip reading abilities I have, and also what slightly can be heard when listening closely, is Godsil saying, quote, it's hospital property. And I can't hear the first part of this, but he says something the hospital, followed by Shaquille saying, quote, it will go back. I don't know, you could try making it out if you will. Since the music is loud, I'll put in the video up here as B-roll so you could take a look at the initial encounter. But it's clear from this video that during that initial encounter, they were in fact talking about the IV pole. Now, Shaquille claimed that this was false arrest in violation of their constitutional rights, as he alleged that he was, quote, racially profiled, harassed, discriminated against, and eventually arrested without probable cause for simply taking a walk outside the hospital where he was a patient. And this claim was further backed up after Shaquille made a Facebook post on July 3rd, 2019 with some significant information. In this post, he said that a, quote, close source with knowledge of the outside investigation and a current Hazel Crest police officer, has given this information under the condition of anonymity. Chief Davis has officially completed his review, and like we knew, Freeport police did not adhere to applicable law regarding detainment and arrest of an admitted hospital patient. Upon interviewing hospital staff, although procedure doesn't typically allow patients outside the hospital, Dr. Murphy and other hospital staff did in fact grant permission and was fully aware of Shaquille's plans of walking around the perimeter of the facility whilst on hospital property. So this was important information, especially because Shaquille always contended that he was permitted to go walk outside by the doctor, yet he was arrested for attempted theft. But while this seemed like it would be an important part of the case, the court claimed that it's, quote, irrelevant that Shaquille was originally arrested for attempted theft, because while Shaquille was initially arrested for attempted theft, court documents state that Sergeant Zelaznik, quote, later decided that attempted theft was not an appropriate charge after speaking with the security guard. And later on, the medical team went on to say that there was apparently no authorization that occurred for Shaquille to walk outside, that no authorization would ever occur for something like this, and that almost always walks are restricted to the floor that the patient is assigned to. So at the end of the day, it didn't matter what Shaquille was originally arrested for, they were going to be charged with disorderly conduct. Not only this, but in addition to the false arrest charge, Credale and Marquandrick were additionally charged with resisting and obstructing a peace officer. But the offense they were charged with or not charged with didn't matter to the court, because all that mattered was whether there was, quote, probable cause to arrest for any crime. And because they found that there was probable cause to arrest the three of them for disorderly conduct, that's the only offense that the court was going to discuss. Marquandrick and Credale, however, didn't believe that there was probable cause to arrest them for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, or obstructing a police officer in the first place. And so they brought claims against this. But the defendants argued that when Godsil had approached the three of them, that the group was apparently being aggressive. And because of this, Godsil felt threatened. Officer Moore also testified that Credale shouting over him was, quote, beginning to obstruct his ability to conduct his investigation. And that Marquandrick was, quote, continuing to talk over officers and not leaving the area when they said he was no longer welcome on the property, which all brought probable cause to arrest them for disorderly conduct. As for the claim of them resisting the arrest, neither side was able to provide evidence that this was the case. But regardless, it was concluded that, quote, probable cause for any offense bars all false arrest claims, and that there is, quote, no right to resist even an unlawful arrest. Either or, regardless what it was they were arrested for, Shaquille and the group then went on to claim that the law was selectively and discriminatorily enforced on them, arguing that the city defendants violated their, quote, right to equal protection of the law as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Now, it's said that in order to establish a discriminatory effect or prove that officers engaged in selective enforcement, they would need to show three things: that they're members of a protected class, that they're similarly situated to people that are not members of a protected class, and that they were treated differently than those people. In this case, however, Shaquille and the group weren't able to uphold the equal protection claim because they weren't able to present evidence or data that the officers hadn't arrested individuals outside of their protected class who were in similar situations. And also because of the fact that officers were directly called to the scene as opposed to just selecting them at random. This was another thing they used to argue. Now, the group tried arguing that statistical analysis wasn't necessary simply because their claim rested on the fact that the officers made the decision to arrest them, but not to arrest Godsil, even though they believed Godsil behaved in the same way that they did. But since there was no evidence that Shaquille and the others requested for Godsil to be arrested, that's where this claim just kind of ended. This did bring up another problem though, because when you go a little further, it brought up the point that Sergeant Zelaznik instructed that his fellow officers shouldn't argue with the group, saying, quote, because they are all alike. While Zelaznik arrived on scene, it was said that he recognized the group, and he referred to Shaquille saying, quote, we don't need to argue with him, he's just like this guy, let's just do what we need to do. To which Shaquille responded, quote, I'm not just like this guy. I know you've dealt with him. What's also very interesting was that Officer Moore testified that the officers were apparently warned at the beginning of their shift one day that Shaquille was in town for the time being. And he further went on to say that Shaquille and the group were apparently known to police as being one to like to argue with police. So because of this, the police were apparently instructed to try avoiding getting into an argument with Shaquille, with Officer Moore further explaining that Shaquille, quote, liked to make it known that he was aware of the laws and would try to provoke a reaction from police. The reason this is significant is because the group argued that they believed that when Sergeant Zelaznik said they were all alike, he meant that they were all alike because of their race. But in the court, the defendants instead used this to argue that based on Shaquille's response, Shaquille himself knew that police were referring to the argumentative nature of the group based on prior incidents as opposed to their race. And they argued that the video showed that Zelaznik's impression of them was based on this. So that's where this claim ended. Nonetheless, Shaquille stated that he, quote, truly feel that because of how we looked, the situation spiraled into something other than what it needed to be. Which brought up another claim of something called Monell, where the group alleged that the city of Freeport, quote, had in effect racially motivated policies, practices, or customs that condoned, fostered, and were the driving force of the unconstitutional conduct of the city. However, they weren't able to find or present any evidence to show any such policies or customs like this, and so this claim was later abandoned. Okay, so it seemed like nothing was coming regarding their claims of false arrest. However, involving more of the medical side, a very significant claim from Shaquille was that the officers on scene, quote, failed to confirm with his doctor that he was healthy enough for transport. And he argued that Officer Holden, quote, failed to administer his inhaler quickly enough during his medical emergency in the back of the squad car. Despite there being a delay in Shaquille receiving his inhaler, what they argued after reviewing the video was that when they were on the scene, Shaquille wasn't having a medical emergency then. And the video also showed that he decided against returning to the hospital, even attempting to remove the IV himself. They also noted the actions Officer Holden took by immediately calling for assistance once he saw that Shaquille was having a medical emergency. And it was further argued that Officer Holden believed that Shaquille was having a seizure, and thus he did what he thought was appropriate to treat a patient having such. In this case, the ambulance arrived within a few minutes and Shaquille appeared to recover just over a minute after Holden called the ambulance. So at the end of the day, their argument was that it wasn't that Holden didn't try to help out, because he did try to help Shaquille. It was just that he wasn't a medical professional. So the fact that he did what he could and called emergency services, those were the correct steps he needed to take in that time for the situation. With the court documents stating, quote, Holden is not a medical professional, and the court can only determine whether Holden, as a law enforcement officer, acted within the scope of reasonable conduct of a law enforcement officer. And although it said that the court could stop there, they also said that Shaquille's claim against Holden is also barred by qualified immunity, as it, quote, protects law enforcement officers as public servants from liability stemming from reasonable mistakes made while performing their public duties. Not only this, but the officers also brought up the point that Officer Holden did mistake Shaquille's medical event as a seizure, but likewise, Shaquille's legal counsel too incorrectly referred to the medical event as a stroke throughout the complaint, despite there being months of preparation they had towards the case to know that it was an asthma attack. Nonetheless, Shaquille's counsel also brought a separate claim titled substantive due process, but like the Monell claim, this too was abandoned. And the last claim against the officers or city defendants was for something called willful and wanton conduct, which is defined as a, quote, course of action that shows an actual or deliberate intention to cause harm, or that if not intentional shows an utter indifference to or conscious disregard for the safety of others or their property. They referred to their complaints of false arrest, equal protection, and failure to provide medical care as support for this claim, stating that the court should leave the question to the jury on whether the officer's actions amount to willful and wanton conduct. But nothing came from this, as well as they found that the officers had no deliberate indifference toward the situation. That was all they had regarding the officers in this case. However, regarding the hospital staff, the group's complaint alleged 3 claims against the hospital defendants. These were intentional infliction of emotional distress, false imprisonment, and negligence. The first 2 claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress and false imprisonment were, however, later abandoned, and the negligence claim was dismissed. Now, when trying to reach a conclusion, the court actually stated that through the recordings, there were in fact certain representations on both sides which were actually incorrect. However, for the reasons previously explained above, in April 2022, they concluded that the federal judge would be dismissing the lawsuit, the civil case overall would be terminated, and the Freeport police would be cleared of any wrongdoing in this case. Now, I'm unsure about the employment status of the security guard Godsil at the hospital regarding this case. However, very recently, in an article posted on July 13th, 2023, it announced that Ryan S. Godsil, a quote, Bloomington man, had pled guilty to sexual assault of a child. Yes, the very same security guard, Ryan Godsil, in this case, pled guilty to 1 count of predatory criminal SA of a minor under 13 years old, all the while this case regarding the hospital was going on. It was said that Godsil's assault of a minor took place sometime between November 6, 2021 to December 1st, 2021. And he was actually previously charged with 3 additional counts of SA of a child, but those were dismissed. Sentencing took place in October 2023, and Godsil was ultimately sentenced to 45 years in prison for this crime. So I say this to say he's definitely not working at the hospital anymore. And for him to do something like this to a child really just shows his character as a person overall. The report from the hospital case recommended that the quote, Freeport Police Department examine its policies for handling incidents involving hospitalized individuals or those requiring medical attention. With Freeport City Manager Lowell Crow saying, quote, while the independent investigation made no findings of misconduct regarding this incident, that doesn't mean we can't learn something from it, and as a community, we will. This report was said to serve as a teachable moment regarding actions to take in certain situations. For example, having officers consider removing handcuffs on a person who's distressed while undergoing a medical episode, and knowing to give back one's inhaler if they're saying they can't breathe. These are future things officers should consider when dealing with cases involving hospital patients. Regarding this case, I am able to see the perspectives from both sides. I understand it's hospital's property and their rules, so yes, a patient can't be wandering around outside. But from experience, I also do understand that whenever you're in the hospital, you really just need some fresh air. It's hard being stuck inside, especially if you anticipate it might be a long time you're in there. I also do understand where Shaquille is coming from regarding feeling targeted for his race. Being followed by employees in stores, having people cross the street to avoid walking past you. There are so many instances as a Black person where I feel and know that I'm being watched or targeted solely based on my race. Things like this have happened since I could remember, and I don't know one Black person who I personally know who hasn't experienced something similar. It's just everyday things that I've kind of gotten used to, so I understand how in that moment you can never tell why the security guard would have approached you, and especially accused you of stealing. Also, when you realistically think about it, why would somebody go to a hospital to steal an IV pole? I don't know, that's just kind of random. But of course, that being said, on the other hand, it is obviously the security guard's job to make sure order is being kept in the hospital based on the rules of the hospital. And if that means you need to get inside with the IV pole, it unfortunately means you need to get inside with the IV pole. Do I think the situation could have been approached differently? 100%. But I still have to look at it from his perspective of what he was thinking in that moment based on his job. What I think overall, regardless of anyone's side, this situation really just seems like a gigantic misunderstanding, because even court documents stated both sides had some recounts of the situation that couldn't be proven. I do think maybe the situation could have been avoided had Godsil maybe paged the care team to show the group that they couldn't walk outside, because even though the independent investigator found that they were, quote, unable to find anyone from the hospital to confirm that Shaquille had permission to go outside, it's still very clear, even in the video, that they were adamant they were allowed outside. Shaquille at the time clearly showed that he believed he was allowed to, and he even made a post during the investigation that I mentioned saying it was allegedly confirmed that a doctor gave them the okay to go outside. If Godsil maybe said, "Oh, you're allowed to? Okay, bet. I'm calling your nurse right now to ask," the nurse would have said yes or no, and then at that point, if they're still arguing, then go ahead, proceed with police. But if the approach was actually like, "Hey, what are you doing? You're stealing," that's where I can see a dispute forming. Because why would I be in a hospital gown, IV hooked up an arm, for me to steal it? Like, what would make you think I would be trying to steal anything? Obviously, we can't see the exact moment the confrontation began, but it seems like this could have been a case of it's not what you say, but how you say it. Because it's not wrong to tell them they need to go back inside. But the being accused of stealing part is where things could get a little bit iffy. Of course, there being 3 of them versus the 1 security guard in a confrontation, it's very fair for Godsil to have wanted backup. He was outnumbered, it's very reasonable and makes sense. It's more the part of being accused of stealing when you're really not, especially in the circumstances you were in and what you were being accused of stealing in the first place, where it's not that shocking for somebody to react how they did. Just looking at the bigger picture, being accused of doing something you're not doing, most people wouldn't feel good about that, especially when you're sick. Now, as mentioned, the investigation consisted of interviews with 5 Freeport police officers and 2 FHN security officers from an independent investigator retained by the Freeport Police Department, Hazel Crest Police Chief Mitch Davis. Davis stated that Shaquille, Marquandrick, and Cordell, quote, failed to show up for 2 scheduled appointments to give Davis their personal versions of the incident. I do wonder why they didn't show up, but I can only guess they might have preferred not to, considering he was an independent investigator retained by the very same police department they were having complaints against. I don't know, but regardless of the reasoning and the actual case itself, I think something else that's very important, which we also really need to address in this case, are hospitals lacking areas where patients can go outside? I've been cooped up in the hospital a few times, for a month being the longest, and each time I would just itch every day to go outside to just get some fresh air. Even if it meant opening the window, something. I just needed fresh air and needed to feel the sunlight on my skin. I think more hospitals in general should start working towards developing designated areas for patients to be able to stay outside for a certain amount of time, or having a monitored room on the same floor where they could, at the very least, crack open a window. Being sick isn't easy, and it's definitely not any easier when you're stuck inside for an extended period of time. So I fully feel that that's something that would be good to work towards in the future for hospitals. Nonetheless, Shaquille seems to be doing well and still doing work advocating in the community. Hopefully this case is truly at the very least a teaching lesson to avoid situations like this from happening again. But yes, that is it for today's video. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think it was justified? Do you think the court should have done more? Please comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.